Hey, well, thanks. Hello, everybody. My name is Philip Ferguson. I'm an associate professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Manitoba, and I'm thrilled to be your session chair today for this session. This is our session 4B on education, outreach, and economics of space. I kind of laugh at this because this is kind of fasten your seatbelts. We're going to talk about lots of different things that are really interesting today. I was joking with the executive director of CASI this morning and saying that perhaps the only thing in common between all of these talks is that everybody is attending CASI Astro 2021. But be that as it may, we're all talking about space and lots of really interesting things to discuss. And we've got 4 different talks today, and we have until 3:15 Eastern time or 2:15 Central, where I am here. So we'll start with our first talk today. It's going to be by Jan Clarence D, and it's called Prospects for the Small Satellite Market. And so Jan here, I don't really have any extra information about Jan, so I'm going to let Jan introduce himself when he starts his talk. I'm sure we'll all really enjoy it. I've known Jan for quite some time. So Jan, take it away.
Thanks very much, Phil. So so my name is Jan Clarence D. I work as a consultant here at Euroconsult, where we specialize in space consulting. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here today. So today, as Phil mentioned, I'm going to be talking about our research on the small satellite market. More specifically, the results of our report that we released earlier this year. So this is just a brief overview of everything that's inside the report itself. Yeah, could you all hear me well? Phil, it's all good?
We are good. Yep, loud and clear, Dan. Take it away.
Awesome. So, just a little bit of a presentation on Euroconsult. I won't go into too much detail since Linda, who is also here in this panel, is also part of Euroconsult, and I'll let her basically take the reins on this slide. But basically, all I just wanted to say over here is that I'm presenting part of our research reports that we do basically every year, which is the small satellite market, which I mentioned over here. So we basically do big market forecast. We profile different commercial integrators, all of this shows different industry trends, all that. So you could send me an email a little bit after this if you want more details on the report, but that's not all why we're here today anyways. So without further ado, I want to show you a little bit of our research. So I really like this graph that we have over here. So I wanted to first start off by showing the trends in the sector, at least the big highlights, at least within the small sat industry. And also, before I continue any further, when I refer to small sats, I refer to satellites under 500 kilograms. So all the numbers that you'll see over here are all for satellites under 500 kilograms. And as you can see from this graph over here, we are in a very interesting phase right now within the small sat industry, moving from one end, which we see a very small number, to right now where we see huge growth in the small sat industry, from about 3,000 to about 14,000, almost 5 years worth of growth. So we're right at the beginning of it, and it's quite exciting. In fact, a lot of this growth that we see over here is very much dictated by the mega constellations that you hear all about. About 50%, almost 50% of all of these 14,000 satellites are going to be from mega constellations alone, which is quite a lot. Mainly, this will mainly be seen from commercial operators, and within that category itself, two commercial operators in particular will account for half of the satellites launched, which is quite a lot. And I'm speaking, of course, of SpaceX and Amazon's mega constellation projects, which will dominate the overall small satellite market in numbers, mass, and also in value, market value, largely skewing the overall market data. But even though if they do skew like the overall data, it should be noted that even so, these constellations are not really representative of the entire industry of small sats, which is highly diverse, with multiple operators, lots of startups, universities, and even emerging countries all starting to enter the field, basically for the first time for many. Many of these constellation operators are also adopting vertical integration, which is something which I kind of want to mention, meaning that these satellite operators are manufacturing their own satellites. Small sat operators, in particular, favor in-house manufacturing rather than procurement, which all in all have a significant impact on the total market value of the satellite small sat industry, as well as affecting overall accessibility for smaller manufacturers as well. Since a lot of these operators are looking to manufacture themselves, there's less space basically for specifically manufacturing satellite manufacturers. Looking forward, we expect about a yearly average of about 1,000 small satellites to be launched per year, with small variations here and there, mostly because with the nature of constellations being cyclical and launching in numerous batches at once. Here's a really, really nice infographic prepared by one of my colleagues. It really shows you like the big highlights of the small sat industry looking forward and looking behind as well. So where I want to bring your attention to is in the number of small sats to be launched per year. So like, and everything below it. So as you can see, we see like a 5-time increase in the satellites launched in the next 10 years compared to the last 10 years. And what's interesting to note is also we notice also a significant increase in terms of mass as well. So what's interesting to note is that some of the smaller operators, some of the smaller satellites are starting to move towards becoming a little bit more larger in terms of mass, because commercial operators in particular are starting to favor performance over mass and cost, in fact, to have their satellite being able to do much more operationally speaking. You can also see this in CubeSats as well, starting to move a little bit more past like the 10-kilogram range and a little bit further up. But at a certain point, it might reach like a threshold, especially for academic or for small tech demo satellites as well. Another interesting thing which I'd like to point out is the relationship between the average number of satellites launched per year and the market value, so the manufacturing and launch value, which I have over here, which is not really increasing proportionately. Like even though the number of satellites are increasing 5 times, the manufacturing launch value is only increasing 3 times, which is quite interesting. If you look, a lot of this is because if you look especially at satellites below 10 kilograms, or i.e. the CubeSats, even like these satellites don't necessarily have the highest price points compared to the hundreds of kilograms of satellites. To paint you a picture, at least, we have about 25%, CubeSats represent about 25% of the satellites small satellites being launched in the next 10 years, but only 1% of the total value, basically. So as you can see, like there's a large discrepancy between both the number of satellites and also the value of these satellites, which is quite interesting, I think. So if you look over to like the very rightmost, you'll see telecom being the most dominant application, to no surprise to many, because of like these large constellations that we see, as I mentioned, Starlink and Kuiper being 2 big ones. EO, however, is expected to grow as well, like throughout the next years, however, less of a market share than telecom. This is because a lot of the EO satellites, EO has been in the market for a longer time than these LEO SATCOM constellations, and a lot of these EO constellations are starting to reach their maturity, at least. So it's a very, very interesting application to look over right now. And the third application that we see right now for small sats in particular is technology demonstration satellites, i.e. Orbit demonstrations, or maiden flights for certain satellites, all of that. So I thought it might also be interesting to talk a little bit more about also looking specifically at the demand and the supply with regards to small sats. Looking at who will manufacture, like the manufacturing market, basically, of the small satellite industry. Interestingly enough, 2/3 of the units to be launched within the next 10 years will be manufactured in-house. However, you will notice that in this graph, on the in-house, it only shows 33%. and which is not 2/3. This is because this graph only shows market value, which kind of shows like a little bit of like the discrepancy, which I mentioned, vertical integration largely affecting basically the value of these the value of these satellites. If you build it in-house, it's of course going to be much cheaper than if you get someone else to do it for you. So yeah, a lot of the small sat industry favors vertical integration a lot, because it allows for economies of scale, better control of their supply, faster innovation, a lot of other different reasons as well. There are also a lot of other players, maybe large integrators, pure small sat manufacturers, all that. However, their market value only occupies a small portion of the total market value, largely due to like the low costs of these small satellite systems as well. So this is a graph which I really, really like, not only because it looks really, really cool, but also because it's really, really interesting as well, the data that's in it. So this over here shows the launch demand and the launch supply within the last 10 years. So not looking forward, but looking behind. On the left side, you see countries, satellite operators, and on the right side, you see the launch providers for these satellite operators. So if we look at launch in particular, we see a lot of interesting things. Launch, first and foremost, is a very global market. And there is a very large imbalance between both the supply and the demand, which leads, like I said, to a very global market. As you can see within this graph, we see a lot of different countries launching their own satellites at other different countries, basically. Of course, sometimes launch providers may not be compatible as well with certain satellite operators, maybe because of their capability or their availability. And as such, these satellite operators may look to launch elsewhere. Such explains the reason why a lot of the US satellite operators are launching in countries such as Europe, India, and even Russia. So now I mentioned how global the launch industry is. However, you'll see if we look forward, at least within the next 10 years, we notice this trend to start to decrease. And it's really interesting because looking forward, we see all of these rise of these new micro launchers and even some of these established launchers starting to create their own rideshare opportunities, such as SpaceX, within the case of US, which basically, if reducing the amount of people looking elsewhere for launches as they favor more domestic opportunities. Domestic retention rates as such are expected to improve within these specialized micro launchers and with these new rideshare opportunities. So one thing which I thought might be interesting also to talk about, something a little bit more relevant to what's happening today, is to talk a little bit about what's the effects of COVID has had within the small satellite industry, and also the all this news we hear about SPACs and all of these companies going public. I thought it might be a little bit more interesting to talk a little bit about this. So if you look at COVID first, we notice that COVID has impacted the satellite industry within 4 different ways. First, we see it through manufacturing delays. Small sat manufacturers in particular have to stop or slow down their production to comply with government regulations. For example, access to space was also impacted with the shutdown of some spaceports as well. Not everyone in particular was affected, but there were some companies that have been fairly affected by this. As well, as a result of this, some of the maiden flights for certain launchers have been delayed as well. And the longer it takes for them to launch their rockets, the longer it will take for them to reach the market. Otherwise, also in the context of uncertainty with COVID-19, commercial entities have been starting to pivot towards government to avoid bankruptcy, maybe in the form of financial support. But also some of these small sat players are also starting to look at government as a more important client, being that they are more reliable and more established than a lot of the commercial players right now. So we're starting to notice a lot of pivoting within the small sat industry with that regard. Investors have also started to become impacted by this, by the COVID-19, given that several companies have seen bankruptcy. A lot of us heard about OneWeb moving on to Chapter 11. So it's no surprise that investors are becoming a bit more conservative with respect to their decisions right now. And with the example of OneWeb and the crash moving towards Chapter 11, it's a reminder that even the most well-funded projects are still prone to risk. It should, however, noted that despite all of these effects of the COVID-19, that growth is still happening within the small sat industry, despite all of this. Its negative effects were overall overestimated, like in our past studies, and we see that right now, especially because of the emergence of the SPAC trend, basically. And the availability of large amounts of capital throughout the pandemic, basically through these SPACs as well, being one of the biggest examples. So I have over here a table showing some of these companies that were that you've heard about that have moved on to like SPACs as well, or like that use that mechanism. And I get a lot of, like, whenever a new SPAC is announced, I always get some questions pertaining to the legitimacy of a lot of these SPACs. More specifically, if these companies will be able to make it through the so-called valley of death, where a lot of startups tend to die. So the way I see it is that SPACs can be seen as a short-term way for a lot of companies to access funds from private investors. So this is especially helpful for the companies who have had difficulties accessing funds through the traditional IPO due diligence process. So they go through the SPAC way. And the nice thing about SPAC is that there is not that much financial oversight within these, which is a good thing for them, but also something for investors to be a little bit more wary about. Because of the natures of SPACs, there is much less control from financial authorities, and therefore revenue projections seem to be overly optimistic in that regard. I've seen companies that announce billions and billions of revenues within their projections, but it's not really realistic of like where they are today and like at least within the next few years. So it's something at least to be a little bit more wary about. I'm not trying to say that they're not legitimate, but I'm just trying to say that investors should become a little bit more skeptical because there's less financial oversight with this regard. So yeah, several companies have claimed billions of revenues based on launch rates, which, and I think at least the reason why, like, for these numbers is because a lot of these companies are considering the total addressable market, but not in fact considering the fact that the total addressable market might be will need to be shared among all of these competitors, basically. So for example, some of these companies still remain very far from their projected launch rates or haven't even launched yet. And I believe, yeah, like I mentioned, they're just projecting from what they see as their total addressable market, not exactly what's applicable to them. So looking at the third point of what I mentioned over here, SPAC funding does not, associated with SPAC funding does not enhance the viability of most of these companies' business models. But there's like a big but over there. Like a lot of these companies have been using these SPAC opportunities, in fact, to diversify their portfolio as well. A good example of this is Rocket Labs. So although they may not be making revenue at the moment with Rocket Labs specifically, they use these funds in order to acquire 4 other companies that have been making revenues instead. So like, you know, a lot of this could be seen as like an opportunity for like these companies. So all this to say that yes, SPACs for many can be seen as either like a lifeline or an opportunity to diversify their whole business model. It will be interesting to see how this trend will affect the mindset of investors moving forward. In fact, I'm quite eager to see what the result of a lot of this is. So to conclude, at least the key takeaways that I want to bring to you guys is that the small sat market is in a period of growth right now, characterized by these large constellations. But while only 2 manufacturers in particular represent a large number of this, it's not exactly representative of the entire satellite industry, which all in all is still growing. and is largely diverse. Vertical integration tends to be has largely affected the entire market as well, skewing market value numbers in particular, and as a result, new entrants, new manufacturers might struggle to enter the market as well, considering this. The third point, COVID-19, concerning COVID-19, the industry still remains resilient despite all of these COVID-19 impacts that it's had. But we're still currently in the pandemic. It's still possible that we have yet to see the full effects of the COVID pandemic as well. One thing which we didn't expect is like this large popularity of SPACs, allowing for short-term opportunities for these companies. But this could also represent a risk for investors moving forward, as profitability for many of these players have yet to be demonstrated in particular. So yeah, that's basically the whole presentation. Before I ended, I wanted to also mention, and Linda will repeat this as well, that we have our next conference. Well, we have a conference coming up, the World Satellite Business Week, but more relevant to you guys, in Montreal, we're having the AIX Space Conference, which is our conference dedicated to AI and space, basically, which is happening next year here in Montreal in person. So I'll let Linda talk a little bit more about that in her presentation. So thank you very much, everyone.
All right, thank you, Jan. Excellent overview of the small satellite market, as always, from Euroconsult. So we will take any questions in the chat if people have any. I know there's a 10-second offset here, so I'll just let some questions flow in. I guess maybe in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, I'll throw one in there, Jan. So if based on your view of this market, if I were an entrepreneur and wanted to start a small satellite market, a small satellite company in this market, what are some of the things that I would want to target to position myself well? I mean, you mentioned that a lot of what we're seeing are coming from primarily two companies that are putting a lot of these small satellites up. Seems like a difficult place to compete, but what would your advice be?
Yeah, like I mentioned, like it is like these two companies that have been occupying like a lot of the market, but like I said, like it shouldn't remove from the fact that the market is still highly diverse and like still very active as well. I would say that it largely depends on the application. Here in Canada, actually, like there's a lot of different opportunities as well. I know there's a lot of CSA people over here, and I'm pretty sure they have a much more. They also have like their opinions on this. There's a lot of opportunities within Canada for small satellite companies in particular to grow. You see like this from Northstar, Kepler, GHGSat, all of these different companies. But it's largely dependent per application. If you look, for example, at like the launch industry, we're facing like it's a very different dynamic compared to something like in the EO industry. I don't know. Like I'd say it largely depends. I'm sorry if I'm giving you such a vague response to this, but it's really hard to answer something that really changes per industry. The small satellite industry in particular, like it changes per application and also per user type. So if you're aiming for like government clients or even commercial clients, or if you're looking more at different types of more focused on a downstream sector or within the space exploration sector, there's a lot of different things to take into account for sure. I'd say access to funds is probably something which we hear most commonly being the most difficult thing for a lot of companies, but also not only access to funds, but also stuff like access to expertise as well, not in terms of technical expertise, but in terms of like business expertise as well. So a lot of these companies in the small satellite industry or startups are engineers and don't really have a background in business, for example. So like it's hard to grasp some of these concepts at first, especially when starting a whole company. So a lot of these companies have been asking for expertise with regards to the business savviness and all that. So, there's a lot of different challenges that we face right now over here, especially if you're like an entrepreneur looking to enter the industry. But yeah, I hope at least I gave a better a better answer in that regard.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right. Well, thanks very much, Jan. I think we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is also from Euroconsult. So our next talk is called Global Space Exploration, a Strategic Outlook and Economic Assessment. This is by Linda Dow. So Linda Dow recently joined Euroconsult as a consultant. She possesses in-depth knowledge and experience in the fields of space health and medicine and policy and science. At Euroconsult, Linda contributes to government consulting missions and reports where she conducts socioeconomic impact assessments and strategic market forecasts. Prior to joining Euroconsult, Linda worked at the Canadian Space Agency, where her roles centered on innovative space health technologies, business development, and corporate project management. She additionally worked at NASA Ames as a graduate researcher in the field of astrobiology. So, Linda, I will hand it over to you, and you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was very nice, Philip. All right. So as you know, I recently joined Euroconsult. That's based in Montreal as a consultant. So today I'll be going over the key drivers and trends in space exploration while also looking at the government investments in the sector. So I'm very excited to be virtually with you today to share Euroconsult's latest insights into this exciting topic of space exploration. So before I jump into the insights, as Jan mentioned earlier, I'd like to dive into a little bit on what Euroconsult does and who we are for those of you who aren't aware of our work. We are a leading global consulting group that is fully dedicated to the space sector and satellite-enabled vertical markets. So for over 30 years, Euroconsult has been providing decision-making support to over 600 corporate and governmental clients across the globe. And our four main business lines include consulting services, thematic training, market intelligence, as well as executive summits. In 2020, we have published 14 market research studies, and this year so far, we've published 11 with 5 more publications in our pipeline. So with that covered, this presentation will cover key content from our 2020 Prospects for Space Exploration report, but not highlighted in this presentation will be the detailed assessments of the 6 applications that are listed on the slide, including orbital infrastructure, transportation, moon exploration, Mars, deep space, and astronomy. But we will cover the general trends. And just a highlight is that the upcoming edition of this report will be released in 2022. Okay, so to start, we all understand that the history of space exploration has been remarkable in the achievements that it has over the years. And rather than dive into the different details of what has happened over the previous years, I'd like to focus your attention on how the drivers and approaches to space exploration have evolved over time. For example, there has been an increase in scientific knowledge from robotic missions to Mars and other deep space that is continuing to expand the different scientific knowledge and technical capabilities that we have, while also really paving the way for future manned missions. And there's also the fields of astronomy, astrophysics, and heliophysics, which will continue to be essential to expand our knowledge about the universe that will help us understand and further our capabilities in space exploration. Of course, the prestige and access of space has been more accessible and increased, and with that comes the economic benefits to space and to the terrestrial industry in terms of the benefits. So respectively, going from peer competition to collaboration, so competition as the space race between the US and the Soviet Union back in history, and then going forward to the International Space Station, where we have started to see an increasing collaborations, not only in human space flight, but also in science and planetary exploration missions. Moving forward, we are entering into what we consider a new era of both collaboration and competition, which is now being joined quite predominantly by the private sector. So we have started to see an increase in commercial activities over the past few years as startups and large companies are seeking to exploit the commercial potential of space exploration. And it really is these commercial space exploration initiatives that are impacting the strategic planning of governments and redistributing the cards between the government and the industry in defining that roadmap and milestones for future space exploration. In fact, space agencies are increasingly seeking to leverage partnerships with the private sector to achieve their goals more cost effectively and share the risk while fostering this sustainable space exploration path forward. As we know, the global vision for space exploration focuses now on establishing this sustainable human and robotic presence on and around the moon, but using this as a pathway to explore Mars. And we do see numerous initiatives that are starting to materialize, like the US Artemis Lunar program, for instance. And so there comes a question, often in space exploration, why specifically the moon instead of Mars at this moment? And there is some strategic value in the moon that plays an important role behind the rationale. It's considered the central piece to achieve the future missions to Mars. And as dictated in the third edition of the Global Exploration Roadmap, there is a global convergence on the human return to the moon as a step forward for Mars in 2030. So going to explain the previous decade of government investment, we see that global expenditures have grown, driven by programs in leading countries and new countries investing in space exploration, such as South Korea, UAE, Australia, and the stabilization of the economy in multiple countries, such as Russia or the European countries, have actually led to an increasing global investments. And you can see on the left-hand side of the side with the bar charts that the global investments are growing at a rate of a 5% 5-year CAGR. And this is to describe the growth rate of the investments in the previous 5 years. And so when we look and analyze in detail the previous decade, we see that the total government investment in space exploration has increased, reaching a peak in 2019 for $20 billion. So to get the data results that led to the bar graph, over 30 countries and space agencies currently lead this global investment. And it comes to no surprise, perhaps, that the US remains by far the leading investor in space exploration, accounting for over 70% of the total funding, followed by China with 13%, Europe, which includes ESA and the National Space Programs at 9%, and then there are others like Japan and Russia. Just to emphasize here, the increase of government investment in the previous decade is really due to the fact that space exploration, particularly for the moon, has been increasing and been a strategic area of investment for governments around the globe. So space exploration, as I mentioned before, is really attracting not only the interest of an increasing number of governments and national agencies, but also the private sector. And we see players from startups to large companies who are becoming more active in this field, where the increase in the commercial activities has been fostered by several factors, such as public-private partnership programs, increase in private investments and other initiatives. And when looking at the timeline of multiple private activities in space exploration, as shown on the right-hand side of the slide, we have seen multiple success cases of commercial space sectors in the past decades, such as through the Commercial Resupply Services to the ISS, the Commercial Crew Development Program, and the regular basis of research in microgravity that is currently on board the International Space Station. Of course, we have also recently heard of the announcement by two main private organizations who are planning to develop their own commercial crewed space station as a replacement for the ISS, one by NanoRacks and Lockheed Martin, and another by Blue Origin and Sierra Space. So it should be a very exciting path forward. Now, with all this increase in involvement from the private sector, we also have seen challenges by them and the exit of some commercial players as perhaps they have failed to raise enough capital or be financially sustainable over the long-term plan. In fact, despite the increase in private funding over the past few years, total private investment in space exploration continues to be, to date, rather moderated and concentrated only on a limited number of actors. And we see that the support from the government as either a customer or a partner or both remains critical to the success of commercial initiatives, especially for new emerging markets. So to complement this, governments are looking to increase their partnerships with the private sector to conduct these future exploration activities and to foster that sustainable model for space exploration. Now, for that reason, we see that the public-private cooperation is consolidating as more of a central item in the exploration roadmap for both LEO and beyond LEO activities through different cooperation streams. For instance, with NASA, there's the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program or the Commercial Crew Development Program. And these programs are, as I mentioned before, where the government is acting as a customer for these commercial services and also a partner. There are increasing private-public cooperations for governments. Some of the key rationales for this include ensuring access to technologies and services while leveraging efficiencies from the commercial sector, obtaining ideas and feedback from the industry consults to help with future planning. There's the sharing of cost and risk of our missions and projects, as I mentioned before, and they have the overall goal of fostering that sustainable growth, as I keep rehashing throughout the slides. For companies, on the other hand, partnering with government enables them to access the know-how, resources, and financial support that they would need to participate. They would be able to gain credibility in front of potential customers and investors, all while trying to ensure a potential revenue stream over the course of the space mission. And so even though public-private collaborations, they bring multiple benefits, there's still some challenges that take place, including the fact that there has to be a mutual understanding of expectations and responsibilities, as well as the fact that private partners have the incentive to invest, especially when it comes to co-funding, and cooperation, of course, can be challenged due to different timelines or priorities or funding allocations. On to the next slide, shows two decades of government investments in space exploration. So in the previous decade, 2010 to 2019, and looking forward from 2020 to 2029. So looking at these future trends of government investments, we estimate that the global government investment for space exploration will continue to increase to reach $30 billion, and these are in US dollars, by 2029. And this represents a funding growth of just about 50% over the coming decade, reflecting an ambitious plan going forward with the moon as a core focus. We see that orbital infrastructure and transportation will remain the largest applications in terms of funding. And this is driven notably by lunar-related programs and LEO projects. We also see that for astronomy, astrophysics, and heliophysics, this ranks third in terms of the most that is invested, and they will continue to be an essential application for space agencies, especially with the flagship launch in December of the James Webb Space Telescope. Now, for the missions launched and to be launched, in terms of growth, moon exploration is anticipated to experience the highest sustained growth This will support future robotic government missions and commercial partnership programs, as we mentioned before. And in fact, moon exploration will dominate with close to 40% of the total missions. And with that, we forecast approximately 130 missions to be launched by 2029, where most of it will be from moon exploration, but some of it also going to astronomy, astrophysics, and heliophysics. In the next decade, we will also see the potential rise of commercial exploration initiatives with close to 25 commercial missions by 2029. This represents, for the Luna initiatives, approximately 18 of the total missions to be launched. Okay, and with that, there are some key takeaways that I'd like to emphasize. So we are now at the turning point for space exploration, where the sector is comprised of numerous activities from the government, but as well as from commercial players, as they plan the moon to be their core focus. Collaborations, both international and public-private collaborations, will continue to consolidate as this essential requisite to achieve that sustainable model for space exploration. And the commitment from partners, although it might be challenged by the current pandemic context, to secure funding, for example, or the government might decide to shift some of their funds towards other economic sectors. Overall, even though there is this pandemic that might cause an impact to delay to the current plans, as we see with humans landing on the moon being delayed by to 2025, and likely it would not change the strategic importance of the moon as being the focus for space exploration. So that covers what I wanted to present, and I won't cover this slide because Jen had previously covered our upcoming exciting event, AI in Space, on June 20 to 22nd, so be on the lookout for that. And with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Linda. So I will turn it over. I know there were a few questions going on in the chat there while we were while you were talking, and Jan was doing a great job answering the questions there. Are there any other questions for Linda now? Anything else? Yeah, no, the public-private partnerships has been something that the Canadian Space Agency has been experimenting with for a number of years now. I think to varying degrees of success, but yeah, it's good to see that starting to grow again.
Awesome, yes.
Okay, I don't see anything in the chat here.
All right, if there's no questions, but if there's questions coming in at a later time, feel free to message Jan or myself on the Feedloop platform. We'd be happy to respond to you thereafter.
Okay, all right. Thanks very much, Linda. So we've had kind of a quick ask here from our last speaker, Adam. So our next speaker here was going to be Salomé, but Adam has another commitment he needs to get to. So Salomé, would you be okay with us putting Adam in right before you? Okay, Salomé says yes. So Adam, you are up next. So Adam will be talking to us about pushing the limits, Launch Canada, and the student rocket innovation. And so many of you, I think, already know who Adam Trumpour is. Adam is a rocket and gas turbine propulsion professional with broad involvement in the industry. He is a gas turbine concept designer at Pratt & Whitney, Canada, and in his spare time, Adam is heavily involved in the liquid propellant rocketry activities, mentors students from rocketry teams, and works tirelessly to advance the cause of entrepreneurial space and rocketry in Canada. He served as a technical advisor for the Base 11 Space Challenge rocket competition and is the co-chair of its Safety Council. He's the founder and president of Launch Canada, an organization founded to support and advance grassroots experimental rocketry in Canada. Adam earned his bachelor's in engineering science aerospace at the University of Toronto and his master of applied science in aerospace engineering from Ryerson University. So with that, I'll give the floor to Adam, and we look forward to your talk. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, we can. Yep, all looks good.
All right, perfect. All right, so as you've probably gotten an impression of, I wear a number of different hats, but today I am going to be placing my focus on the pretty impressive surge of interest that we've been seeing over the last several years in student rocketry right across Canada. So as everybody knows, we are seeing a pretty unprecedented time of change in the space industry globally. Canada has been a major player from the very beginning, but today we're seeing a lot more competition, both from new national players as well as new innovative companies, obviously SpaceX being one prime example of that, but of course there are many. And the reality is Canada for a number of years has not really been doing enough to adapt to this changing reality, and we have been increasingly falling behind. Now, part of this comes down to a pretty fundamental issue of mindset. And when most people look at the Canadian space sector, we see a few areas that are pretty iconic and well known. But outside of these core competencies or niche areas, historically, there has been very little support for anything else. And we have very often tended to fall into this self-limiting mindset that says, you know, we're a very small country. We need to stick to what we've always done and not branch out into new things. But fortunately, that has been starting to change, and it's been changing in some very interesting and surprising ways. Over the last 8 years or so in particular, right across the country, a grassroots rocketry movement has been growing. It's been driven to a very large extent by students, amateurs, and young professionals who've been seeing what's happening internationally with companies like SpaceX and many others, are inspired by it, and are no longer satisfied with being told that we don't do that here. We've gotten to the point, in fact, where there are now more than 20 major university rocket teams nationwide, representing well over 1,000 active members. Every one of these teams are building some very sophisticated suborbital rocket vehicles and pushing the envelope in a whole host of rocket-related technologies. Many of them are even getting into their own propulsion system development, and 2 of the top teams in the country are actually working on liquid propellant rockets capable of reaching suborbital space, 100-kilometer altitude. It's seriously impressive, and we've reached the point now where rocketry is actually the largest and fastest growing area of student space-related activity in Canada by a very significant margin. And these teams exist ultimately because of student engineering competitions, and one in particular, the Spaceport America Cup. So this is the world's largest advanced level rocket engineering competition, and it gives students a lot of latitude to participate with projects of different size and complexity. Some enter using commercially made solid rocket motors and focus on developing other aspects of their vehicle, structures, avionics, and payloads, while others do go so far as to develop their own hybrid or liquid propulsion systems and get right into the meat of rocketry. And what's been so fascinating is that from almost the very beginning, the Canadians have routinely been dominating at this competition and regularly winning a disproportionate number of the awards, even against American teams with 10 times the funding and former members working at companies like SpaceX and others who come back to mentor them. So the fact that we've seen the kind of performance from Canadians that we have all in this area of space technology that supposedly we don't do here is nothing short of stunning. But to get a sense of just how far this can go, there's actually another competition called the Base 11 Space Challenge that might be the most ambitious student engineering competition in the world. This is a $1 million US prize for the first student-built liquid rocket to reach 100 kilometers altitude. Canadian and American teams are taking part in it. I was the technical designer for this competition and co-chair at Safety Council. And remarkably, a Canadian team is currently the front runner in this competition. That team is Space Concordia from Montreal. And as of this summer, they've now fired by far the largest student-built rocket engine ever in the world. And their engine, you can see it on its test stand in the bottom corner here, actually is higher thrust than the Rutherford engine that Rocket Lab uses on their Electron launch vehicle. And this has come from students who 2.5 years ago had never built a rocket engine of any type. So once again, the same kind of stunning performance we've been seeing with other competitions has been carrying over even into something this extreme. Now, while this grassroots approach to rocketry is a new phenomenon here in Canada, it isn't new globally, nor is it some sort of a lunatic fringe activity. And if you go back to the very beginnings of rocket development in the 20th century, it was in fact entirely driven by amateurs just like this. The liquid rocket was invented by Robert Goddard, a lecturer doing it in his spare time. Werner von Braun and the German rocket scientists who later went on to become the architects of the American space program largely got their start as part of an amateur rocket group in Germany called the VFR. Their Soviet counterparts got started the same way. And this is carried through to the present day, where amateur rocket activities have proven to be a disproportionately valuable means of practical skills development. The gentleman in the figure on the right here is Tom Mueller. He was the co-founder of SpaceX and their original head of propulsion, designer of all of their major rocket engines. And he got his start partly with an amateur rocket group in California. So to this day, this has been a major source of real skills development. And we're seeing the same thing happening in Canada now for much the same reasons. So what we've actually been seeing over the last several years is this emerging ecosystem that largely began with the students and amateurs, but it's actually spread out to become a lot more all-encompassing. And we now have an active amateur rocketry community, but we also have multiple university research groups right across the country. And in addition to that, there are now at least 4 Canadian launch vehicle startups, all working towards space launch vehicles. Every one of them have received some significant government and private funding, and every one of them was also either founded by former university rocket team members, or else hires almost exclusively from among those teams, simply because that's where to find proven talent in the country right now. And finally, to round all of this out, we also have Maritime Launch Services who have been setting up what they hope to become Canada's first ever orbital spaceport in Nova Scotia. So in just a few short years, we've seen this burgeoning student movement begin to seed the creation of an entire new space technology ecosystem. So after several years of working on my own rocket propulsion projects and building up a skill set that is not really common in this country, and increasingly mentoring more and more of the student teams, I was hitting the limits of what I could do as one person in my spare time. So I started Launch Canada as a nonprofit to pull together and support this emerging Canadian rocketry community in the broadest possible sense. I won't read everything on here, but we are taking a very holistic approach to trying to help carry this forward. That obviously includes education. It includes a major focus on the safety aspect and making sure that students and others who want to enter into this field have access to the kind of support and resources they need to be safe and successful. We're also finding that students can be incredibly innovative, and in many cases, some of these teams are developing technologies that could well become the bases for new startup companies. So we want to help shepherd that along, and we want to make sure that we are doing it collaboratively every step of the way. But rocketry also has an amazing ability to inspire, as we've clearly been seeing. But that inspiration has to be matched with actual opportunity to run with it and carry it forward. So it's Launch Canada's mission as well to make sure that regardless of who or where they are, any Canadians who are so inspired can see a way forward and get the support they need to be safe and successful. And in spite of the challenges of the pandemic, we've seen this Canadian rocketry movement continue to grow, with many teams from schools that have little to no other aerospace content in any of their academic programs. So really, they've been making this industry accessible for students in huge areas of the country where it simply never was before. And as you can see today, we've got nearly 1,200 students actively involved in this. So for about the last 2 years, the pandemic has meant that launch competitions obviously haven't been able to happen, and it's really limited the students' ability to work on their own projects. But we've been rolling with this to support them in any way that we can. And this summer, as vaccine rates increased and COVID restrictions began to be lifted, I made a gargantuan push to try to finish my own liquid rocket engine test rig and involve the students along the way and turn this into a major hands-on event series to try to demonstrate real professional approaches to rocket engine testing and safety and give these students the chance to really get their hands dirty in a serious way, all the while showcasing state-of-the-art hardware, instrumentation, and testing practices. So over the course of the last roughly 4 months, we had multiple field days working our way through training and familiarization, developing procedures and checklists, progressing through to cold flow testing to start calibrating sensors and equipment, and conduct dress rehearsals. And finally, this all culminated just a few weeks ago with a full static firing of a 1,000-pound thrust liquid oxygen kerosene rocket engine that you can see right here. We ran it for about 35 seconds. It performed flawlessly, hit its design performance exactly, and worked great the very first time. So we had the opportunity to really demonstrate to students that you actually can be successful with something even as complicated as this if you approach it in the right way. And many of these students were left pretty awestruck by the whole experience and went from not knowing how to properly assemble a bolted joint or run cables to plumbing up liquid oxygen lines and routing and testing high-end instrumentation. So this was an enormous success, and it's something that we want to turn into an ongoing rocket boot camp series to help continue to build on this and make it an integral part of the sort of valuable industry-focused hands-on education that you really don't get in school. Another major focus during the pandemic was on more virtual sessions and training. And so a little over a year ago, we kicked off a Launch Canada lecture series that included a whole series of talks from a whole host of industry veterans, and you can see some of our A-list rocket celebrities here, as well as talks on more technical and safety-related subjects related to the finer points of rocket engineering, as well as broader subjects like systems engineering and entrepreneurship. So these ended up being wildly well received and helped to really keep the morale up among the students during what was otherwise a pretty difficult time. And we're going to be doing more of this going forward and hopefully progressing this into a real ongoing curriculum to, again, help with the badly needed skills development for all of this community. But then there's also our centerpiece event, which was intended to happen a couple summers ago, but the pandemic kept kicking that one down the road. But we're now building towards an actual rocket launch competition in 2022 that's going to be modeled somewhat after the Spaceport America Cup, but is going to also include a technology development challenge to get the students actively thinking about what are the core technical problems in rocket development, and how could maybe some of this lead to entirely new startups. So why does all of this matter? Well, obviously, one piece of it is the scale. We've really never seen anything like this with this kind of interest in rocketry in Canada. It's all the more impressive when you consider that aerospace has always been a very regional industry. And for people outside of these major aerospace clusters in the Montreal area and GTA and a few other isolated pockets, many people simply haven't had a lot of opportunities to get into this field. These students have been changing that, and they've been creating a path into the industry for parts of the country where it just never existed before. Obviously, it's inspiring. The accomplishments of companies like SpaceX nowadays has really been almost an Apollo 11 type moment for a lot of students. And just like the Apollo program, it's drawing a lot of students into STEM nowadays. At the same time, it's so valuable because it really harnesses the drive and passion of the students to learn and to innovate. They're not doing this to get marks or to prepare for an assignment. They're doing it to develop real hardware and go through that real world systems engineering approach. And that's inspiring them to really go the next level and take a step beyond what their studies ever give them. The goals are audacious, and we talked about the liquid propellant space shot, which is really, really extreme. And what's more remarkable is that these students are doing things for tens of thousands of dollars that would cost any company hundreds of thousands or millions to replicate. So the work that is coming out of this really is a totally novel approach to aerospace innovation as well as skills development. And ultimately, it's about so much more than just rockets. There is nothing more multidisciplinary than a rocket project. Every area of engineering works its way in, usually at a very advanced level, and the students are gaining all of this experience along the way. And fundamentally, this whole initiative is really intended to address one of the most basic paradoxes that exists in the aerospace industry, that this cutting edge industry also tends to be extremely conservative due to the simple fact that the cost of failure tends to be extremely high. So the model that makes Silicon Valley such an innovation powerhouse doesn't translate easily into aerospace. Because the costs are always so much higher. But our student-focused approach actually allows us to create conditions where the cost of failure can be as low as it ever could, and all the outcomes are ultimately successes. A wise man once said that when failure is not an option, the cost of success can be prohibitive. And so this is really what we're trying to address. And the students really show a way that that can happen. The primary objective of any of these student projects is to learn. So obviously we create opportunities to do that. And when learning is the goal, it doesn't matter if the rocket fails. In fact, it's often through failures that some of the most valuable learning can happen. But this focus on learning as opposed to delivering a product on schedule and under budget frees the students to be genuinely innovative. And so as a result of that, we also see student teams developing whole new technologies and capabilities. They can do this much cheaper than any company ever could. They don't have to pay payroll. Their costs, their overhead are all virtually non-existent. They can leverage university facilities and support from companies and such sponsorships. And they can embrace a level of technical risk that no company would ever touch, again, because their focus is on learning. It's been training students not just for jobs in the narrow field of rocketry, but throughout the traditional aerospace industry as well, because these projects are so multidisciplinary and the skills are so transferable, and they're getting the opportunity to experience the complete design, build, test, and iterate cycle. That's incredibly rare in schools. But finally, as we've also talked about, this has led to the creation of several startup companies that are actually working towards addressing the problem of space launch in the Canadian context. So all of this has come together in just a few short years out of this student impulse to engage with rocketry and this emerging area of space technology. So in summary, this is really taken off. so to speak. It's given students an unbelievable chance to close this gap between the theory and the practice. It's been said that rocket science is actually pretty easy. It's rocket engineering that's hard. So this is what we're trying to give them. We're trying to harness this excitement and motivation and help them to really run with it. They're incredibly innovative. They're doing remarkable new things. They're creating new companies. And at the end of the day, this is real systems engineering that they're learning. It's complex. There's no easy single answer. It gives them a really valuable taste of the real world. And we have a real opportunity to help grow this, and doing so benefits everybody, whether the launch sector or the established industry as well. So I wanted to give everybody a sense of just the way that this has all been progressing over the last few years. We're at a remarkable time in this industry. And if you're interested in knowing more or getting involved in actually helping to support and grow this, please reach out anytime.
Okay, thanks very much, Adam. Excellent as always. So I think in the interest of time, we may just have to take a few questions just in the chat. I want to make sure that we give enough time to our final speaker, Salomé. So I guess so. Go ahead and well, thank you, Adam, for your time today. I appreciate it. And if there's any other questions, we can tackle them in the chat there. And Adam, if you wouldn't mind just sticking around a couple minutes and maybe answering a few if there are.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks very much. So I'll introduce our final speaker today. Her name is Salomé Paradis, and she'll be speaking on outer space human rights. And I've just got a brief little introduction here for Salomé. So Salomé is currently completing her master's degree in international and transnational law. Previously, she obtained a bachelor's degree in international studies and modern languages, as well as 2 certificates in law and Russian studies. Throughout her university career, she was involved in multiple committees, and developed knowledge in various branches of law. In 2017, she took part in the Harvard National Model United Nations, where she defended Indigenous rights. The following year, she participated in the National Model United Nations in New York and with the Association pour la Simulation de Nations Unies de Université de Laval. She then debated the protection of human rights in the context of the fight against terrorism and Simulation of Human Results Council. Subsequently, she held the position of Vice President for Diplomatic Affairs within the ASNUUL 2018 to 2019 Steering Committee, a position which consisted of establishing links between Université Laval delegation and the country then represented South Africa. In addition, she was the general coordinator of the Quebec Model United Nations in 2019, a simulation bringing together hundreds of students from the province. More recently, she contributed to the mandate of the Uyghur Tribunal as a clinical intern at the Clinique de Droit International Panel de Humanitaire. As a member student of the group de recherche en droit de services financiers, she's currently working as a research assistant under the supervision of Professor Cynthia Duclos as part of a project for an integrated and simplified approach for to the supervision of investment services. So that's really super impressive, Salomé, and I'm really looking forward to your talk today. So I'll ask you to take it away.
Yes, thank you, Philip. You can all hear me well and see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Great. So, well, thank you very much for this introduction. It was very great. Yes, so, and it is truly an honor to be presenting my research today with all of you. So today it will be about law, my presentation, not economics or education. I will be discuss the research I've conducted about outer space human rights. So to do so, the presentation will be in 4 stages. First, I will begin with the phenomenon that led me to wonder about human rights in outer space, which is the privatization of space. Then I will summarize the 2 legal frameworks behind my topic. And after that, I will present the result of my research with the 2 pillars that could better implement human rights in outer space. Finally, I will conclude with a few words about my current research. So the privatization of space, I know you all aware of this already, so I'll be really brief. Well, basically, following the space race of the 20th century, a new space race has begun, but this time between private actors. And the growing involvement of private actors in space is transforming the exclusively state system of the past. Space exploration and habitats will be eventually undertaken by representatives of humanity born on Earth, free and equals in rights and dignity. However, some human rights will inevitably be jeopardized by the context of space exploration, such as the freedom of movement and the right to a standard of living adequate. Space habitats represent lethal environmental conditions not experienced on Earth. So questions are arising about the capacity of the outer space regime and the current international human rights law to ensure sufficiently fundamental needs on celestial bodies, especially with the growing role of the private sectors. So, can human rights be universal across the frontier of outer space? And how could outer space human rights be formulated? So space law basically is a mix of different national and international law. To put you in context, I will briefly discuss the history of space law. So in 1926, space law was mentioned for the first time as a distinct legal corpus. The Soviet Air Ministry then questioned the sovereignty beyond airspace. Then, following the end of World War II, as space institutions were being established, space law began to be written. And within the United Nations system, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, so COPUOS, its role is to oversee the implementation of treaties related to space. And there are 5 treaties regulating outer space activities. So the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Moon Treaty. Nowadays, space law is building its own path. It does not produce any more treaties since 1979. Instead, it is now evolving accordingly to other types of governance, such as soft law. As for national sources, states have started to develop domestic frameworks in order to regulate space activities specific to their territories. So, for instance, Canada has developed its national space legislation with regards to satellite security, sustainable use, and its multilateral relations. As for the United States and Australia, they are the states with the most elaborated space law. The UK has also developed a framework to meet its specific needs. So that is the big picture of the current framework for outer space activities. For international human rights law, there is a plethora of human rights law sources. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is, of course, the backbone of international human rights law, but there is also many more instruments. And those instruments have a unique character. International law instruments traditionally regulate relations between states with the aim of securing certain benefits. But a human rights instrument, on the other hand, imposes obligations on states and grants fundamental rights to a beneficiary who is not normally subject to agreements, to international agreements, and that is the individual. And furthermore, there are critics surrounding international human rights law, one of them being the Western centrism controversy. Human rights were born in the West, and their interpretation is hence not the same around the globe. Besides, many affirm that the enjoyment of human rights is not universal because implementation depends on political, institutional, cultural, and geographical factors. In outer space, the implementation of some human rights is quite difficult. As James A. Datter describes, the condition in space habitats is crowded, no privacy, constant noise or silence, constant motion, reduced or increased gravity, extreme heat or cold, dust or mold, toxic atmosphere, solar radiation, asteroid bombardment, and isolated for the rest of human society for extended periods. So those conditions have no parallel on Earth. With that in mind, the right to adequate living standard, the freedom of movement, the right to life, liberty, personal security, the right to privacy, freedom from torture, appear to be, to different extent, jeopardized. How could someone fully enjoy its freedom of movement in a restrained habitat with limited access to vital resources such as water and oxygen, and moreover, without any guarantee of return? The Outer Space Treaty, so one of the legal instruments, provides that states' activities in outer space should comply to international law. So even if space is not beyond a state sovereignty, international law applies to states' action, and so is international human rights law. But written as it is now, the legal implementation of human rights is hardly transposable, is hardly adapted to outer space conditions. Terrestrial environment is a prerequisite to the set of rules regulating human rights. And therefore, outer space is a border over which the full enjoyment of some human rights is limited. So, and that brings me to the third part of the presentation. While current regulatory human rights instruments are not suited for extraterrestrial life settlement and exploration, besides, the private sector is insufficiently liable for human rights violations, and no outer space Bill of Rights has yet been implemented. So with those issues in mind, I would like to suggest two possible regulatory pillars that could transpose fundamental rights in space. So the private sector responsibility and the Outer Space Bill of Rights. A private company is only bound to international law through the jurisdiction of the state it is attached to. And the wording of international instruments create legal uncertainty concerning the private sector responsibility. However, the private sector is highly involved in space and will be even more so in the future. And SpaceX, for instance, will not recognize international law on Mars or on other celestial bodies. Instead, it intends to adopt a set of self-governing principles and make its own law at the time of a Martian settlement. And also, there is no international authority that can regulate private space activities. For example, COPUOS does not have the authority to force private companies to comply with its corpus. Therefore, the private sector should be held directly accountable for human rights violations in space. And the direct responsibility of private societies could be achieved in two ways. On the national level, a human rights obligation could be achieved through contract. For instance, the Australian Space Activities Act that grants the state a jurisdiction over the supervision of private activities through licenses, permits, and exemptions. So to launch from Australia, a private company must be insured, and the minimum coverage it must obtain is about 715 million Australian dollars. In most countries that allow private space activities, company must be insured to cover physical and financial risks. So my point here is that these private contracts could also have human rights obligations in order to obtain or maintain the insurance coverage. On the international level, I suggest an international binding framework for enterprises. So 2 documents, the norms on the responsibilities and the global pact for the environment. So those 2 documents could be a starting point in that aim. The norms, the first document I'm talking about, is not a binding instrument, but in its first article, it recognizes the obligations of the private sector to ensure respect of human rights within their respective sphere of influence. And the second document, the global one, it's for the globe, so it does not apply to space. Nevertheless, it is the first binding instrument project that would allow to legally sanction companies that violate human rights. And as for a Bill of Rights, well, I suggest the possibility of liberating Mars and other celestial bodies. In accordance with the Outer Space Treaty, a Martian citizenship would grant self-determination free of any sovereign nation. So this leeway would also allow the establishment of a Bill of Rights and or a constitution implementing fundamental space rights. And the space community have already started to address human rights concerns. For example, in 2014, the astrobiologist Charles Cockell elaborated the draft of a Martian colony constitution, and this drafting suggested a Bill of Rights adapted to the unique condition of the red planet. The proposition included provision to leave the colony and have oxygen supplied at all time. Also, Freeland and Jaku from McGill, believe that fundamental rights should shape hard and soft law instruments of space. Additionally, Use ad Astra, so that is a legal project, and it aims at developing an international treaties clarifying the fundamental legal principles and human rights applicable to current and future activities across outer space. So with those research and readings, I believe the following rights should be taken into consideration in space. So the right to oxygen, the right to protection from solar radiation, the right to habitable environment, the right to communicate with Earth, and the right to return. By protecting those needs ahead, it will facilitate potential medical, psychological, and biological challenges. So in short, outer space human rights should be promulgated for safe and sustainable use of outer space. And also, I would like to briefly introduce the research I'm currently working on, which is more related to economic. I am currently writing about the money laundering in the space industry. In a few words, according to the Financial Action Task Force, economies with growing or developing financial centers, but with inadequate controls, are especially vulnerable to money laundering. And outer space, well, the industry is an emerging market and an investment business sector. And many of the legal loopholes that facilitate money laundering are founded in this market. So more specifically, I am looking at how does the fragmentation of space law contributes to the money laundering in the space industry. So I'll be happy to share my result on this in the near future. So with that being said, here is my references for today. And I thank you, and I open the floor to questions.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Salomé. That's a fascinating talk, and it's something that I don't think we as technical people really think a whole lot about. So I think that's really fascinating. We do have time for a question or two before we wrap up. Is there anybody that has any questions that they can put forward here? So we'll just give people to type something in the chat there if there is anything. Nope. Okay. Well, so I would like to then thank all of our speakers today and thank everybody for attending this session here on education outreach and the economics of space. Hopefully we'll see you for the other events that we have planned for CASI-ASTRO. And actually, I'd like to put in a quick little plug for tomorrow's discussion. We've got a panel discussion on test beds and analogs, but right before that, we have a really interesting keynote speech from one of our Canadian astronauts, Dr. Jenny Seide. And she'll be speaking about a really fascinating new research opportunity that many of us may have in the future to get some things into suborbital test beds. So we've got a really great day planned for tomorrow and for the rest of the day today, also at CASI-ASTRO. So thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of the conference. We'll talk soon.